Bill Furioso here at Christ's Table with a message I've entitled A Call to God-Centered Art. A Call to God-Centered Art. And the subtitle is A Foundation for a Biblical Aesthetic. This message is being recorded and posted onto YouTube. And if you go to the homepage of our website, you'll see a link to YouTube where you'll find this message and other messages posted. And also on the homepage of our website, there's another link going to another site where you can find these messages in PDF format and download them and read them as you listen. The address to our website is www.christstable.org. A call to God-centered art. I'm beginning with a preface, like the motivation as to why I wrote this message. C.S. Lewis's essay, Abolition of Man, and Richard Weaver's work, entitled Ideas Have Consequences, both present a philosophical view of human history as descending from absolute truth to relativism, or from objectivism to subjectivism. Other authors have written about the effects of this phenomenon on the arts. For example, Eric Kahler's Disintegration of Form in the Arts, and Hans Ruckmacher's Modern Art and the Death of Culture. In his work, How Shall We Then Live?, Francis Schaeffer discussed what he called the line of despair, tracking a descent from objectivity, order, and form to subjectivity, disorder, and fragmentation, which has taken place in Western history and culture. Now, whether or not one is particularly versed in philosophy or theology, I believe this phenomenon and its outcomes are clear to any interested observer in the arts. The focus on the objective beauty of both order and form in the natural creation belongs to art of a bygone era. Most consistently, the perceived and expressed reality of almost all modern and postmodern art is a subjective communication of fragmentation and disorder. Beyond this, the predominant focus of today's artists is to communicate novel self-expression, mirroring the ills of our human condition. Personally, I find our Western culture milieu wearisome. And while I believe that humanity has been created in the image of God, I find the near glorification of self-expression tiresome. And in comparison to the infinite nature, attributes, and mysteries of God, I find the current artistic fixation on humanity boringly repetitious. Thus, this essay is a call to God-centered art, in which those artists who do hold a biblical worldview will adventurously investigate the attributes of God, who has revealed himself in his creation, in the scriptures which he has inspired, and in his incarnation, Jesus Christ, with a view to definitively reflecting and daringly expressing such a worldview in their works of art as an act of worship to the Ancient of Days and the great I Am. Now, as I continue, I just want to encourage you to download this in the PDF format, because there are quite a few footnotes in my essays, and particularly in this one, which I am not going to digress to read, the footnotes. And so some important things will probably be left out. And you can take a look at those footnotes, obviously, if you have the PDF format to look at. But I'll continue with, introducing this essay with a quote from G.K. Chesterton from his work entitled Heretics. He said, "But there are some people, nevertheless, and I am one of them, who think that the most practical and important thing about a man is still his view of the universe. We think the question is not whether the theory of the cosmos affects matters, but whether, in the long run, anything else affects them." That was by Chesterton. This essay is an exploration in the field of aesthetics, with a view to coming to a foundational understanding of the nature of art in the context of a biblical worldview, which will hopefully prove to be of some value for artists in their creative endeavors for the glory of God. Ultimately, it is a call to God-centered art. We will be discussing art from a philosophical and a theological perspective. In our endeavor to understand art as an expression of reality, we will also be looking into some scientific aspects of perception. I believe the content applies to all the various art forms, and while various concepts will be discussed in more detail, following are some simple definitions. A definition of worldview. The term worldview will be used to mean a perception of reality. A perception of reality. This is the essential meaning of worldview. There are, in fact, many worldviews which have been categorized and classified in various ways. The term art. Similarly, published definitions of art are exhaustive. Here, in this essay, the term art will be succinctly and simply defined as a form of human communication expressing perceived reality. Again, it's a form of human communication expressing perceived reality. Artists communicate their perceptions of reality through the use of various mediums, such as words, images, sounds, movements, etc. Some art forms utilized by artists would be literature, poetry, painting, sculpture, music, dance, etc. Their works of art are reflections of reality, mirroring their perceptions. As perception is integral to communication, reflection and expression, so also worldview is integral to art. I'm going to repeat that. As perception is integral to communication, reflection, and expression, so also worldview is integral to art. The enterprise of art and the pursuit of the artist is all about perceiving and communicating reality. Well, how about that word reality? one understands and defines reality according to one's worldview. In this essay, which is written from a biblical worldview, ultimate reality is defined as God. All that God has created, which is universally accepted as reality, reflects that ultimate reality. It is therefore proposed that what artists recreate should also reflect that ultimate reality. And then the word aesthetics. It can be simply defined as the study of the relationship between art and reality. I think you more often find it defined as the study of beauty, which is correct. I don't think it's a very useful definition, and it's particularly not useful in this essay, what I'm trying to get at. But aesthetics will be defined as the study of the relationship between art and reality. In this essay, it will be proposed that aesthetics, as a philosophical discipline, should address the relationship between God and art, or between art and God. Aesthetics should address the relationship between art and God. Now, here's a brief etymology of the word aesthetics. The Greek word asthonome is a verb meaning to perceive. In turn, the Greek word asthriterion is a noun meaning the faculties of perception. Therefore, this discussion of aesthetics will be grounded in the phenomenon of perception. So let's talk a little bit about perception and the faculties of perception. For analysis, we can separate perception into two processes. Firstly, the processing of sensory input, which transforms low-level information into higher-level information. The processing of sensory input. Secondly, there's the processing connected with a person's previous experience and knowledge, as well as mechanisms such as attention, which influence one's perceptions and expectations. A person's previous experience and knowledge influence one's perceptions. Various forms of sensory stimulation combined with our previous experience and knowledge allow us to create our overall perception. Perception is shaped by learning, memory, expectation, and attention. It is significant to note that perception is a continuous learning experience. What some refer to as a perceptual set is a disposition to perceive things in a certain way based on expectations shaped by previous experience. A perceptual set is a predisposition to perceive things in a certain way because of expectations that have been shaped by previous experience. Essentially, one's perceptual set is one's worldview. It's another phrase, predictive coding, is a theory of cognition in which the brain is constantly generating and updating a mental model of the sensory input. The model is broadcast through the network of sensory processing brain regions. In each region, the model being propagated is compared to the current sensory input, and if they do not match, something called a prediction error is sent back up the network to the model and is revised. Again, perception is a continuous learning experience. This is why the more familiar one is with art in general, and the more familiar one is with a particular artist and a specific work of art, the more one perceives, and the more one understands, and the more one appreciates the art. I believe this concept of perception as being a learning experience can be paralleled to that which the Apostle Paul referred to as the renewing of the mind. And of course, that's in Romans 12, verse 2, Ephesians 4, verse 23, and Titus 3, verse 5. The renewing of the mind. Perception being a continuous learning experience. Connecting that with Paul's concept of the renewing of the mind. To put it in other terms, the processes of predictive coding, one's mental models, are being continuously generated and updated, thus changing and renewing one's perceptual set or worldview. And of course, for Christians, Paul would endorse that the input source of our experience and knowledge be the Word and the Spirit of God, through which we perceive His glory in the face of Jesus Christ, as he says in 2 Corinthians 3:18 and 2 Corinthians 4, verse 6. If it's the input that builds our experience and knowledge, Paul obviously would be espousing that input source of our experience and knowledge would be the Word of God and the Spirit of God, through which we perceive His glory in the face of Jesus Christ. Thus, our perception of reality would constitute a biblical worldview. And the reflection of reality through our works of art would reflect and glorify God. Now, the term aesthetics as a branch of philosophy, specifically the philosophy of art, I think I'm using that as being synonymous. Aesthetics is a philosophy of art. If we agree that art is concerned with communicating perceptions of reality, then aesthetics is connected with the fundamental branch of philosophy known as ontology. Ontology is the study of being, namely, how we define reality. Therefore, when we speak of ontology, we are again essentially referring to worldview, that is, one's perception of reality. I'd like to purport that theology, the study of the nature of God, is the quote-unquote backstory, so to speak, of ontology and one's worldview. Theology is the backstory of our worldview. For instance, Christianity asserts that the biblical revelation of God is the basis of reality, while atheism asserts that the absence of any God is the basis of reality. And pantheism, another worldview, asserts that the divine is the reality of all things that exist. Everyone, from atheists to pantheists, have a theology, a view of God, whether positive or negative, selective or all-inclusive, but a view of God nevertheless. Therefore, everyone has a theology, whether it's biblical or atheistic or pantheistic. And that theology is the foundation of one's worldview. To summarize thus far, we understand that worldview is a perception of reality, and that art is a form of human communication expressing perceived reality. We also understand that worldview is the ontology and the foundation of the philosophy of art. Therefore, philosophy of art, or aesthetics, is the study of the relationship between art and reality. That is, how reality is communicated or expressed or reflected in works of art. And again, in a biblical worldview, we are dealing with the relationship between art and God. That is, how God's attributes are communicated or expressed or reflected in works of art. Continuing on with the concept of worldview. In aesthetics, the question is asked, as an artist, what is the reality I am perceiving and reflecting in my works of art? As we have established, our perceptions of reality is determined by our particular worldview. So we all answer this question according to our worldview. Our simple definition of worldview is a perception of reality. But there are two more definitions from notable scholars. Here's one from Abraham Kuyper. A life system rooted in a fundamental principle from which is derived a whole complex of ruling ideas and conceptions about reality. Another definition of worldview by Francis Schaeffer. A perspective on life, a whole system of thought that answers the questions presented by the reality of existence. So bottom line, worldview has to do with our perception of reality. There are a good number of different presentations of the various worldviews. The listing, labeling, defining, and categorizing of all the various worldviews is interesting and exhaustive endeavor indeed. I will leave that task for others to work out. Suffice to say that all worldviews speak in various ways to the basic and ultimate issues of life, existence, and afterlife. And all worldviews hold various perspectives regarding the main branches of philosophy and the various disciplines of scholarly study. For our purpose here, we would classify worldviews into two very broad categories representing two different views of reality. And those two are naturalism and supernaturalism. Naturalism is the view that everything in the universe, including plant, animal, and human life forms, and all their faculties, consists solely of physical matter. There's no such thing as soul or spirit. The material universe is all that exists. Only that which can be observed with the senses is real and is to be investigated by and explained through the scientific method alone. That's naturalism. Now, by the term supernaturalism, I simply mean the general contrasting view that reality has a spiritual dimension. There are different varieties of supernaturalism. One supernatural view maintains that only the spiritual dimension exists. All else is illusion. And what appears to be many separate things in nature actually all belong to one impersonal, grand, spiritual force which alone is reality. Another supernatural view regards material things to be real, but sees a spiritual dimension behind the physical dimension, in which spirit entities spirit entities control the activities of all things in nature. And there's a supernatural worldview which recognizes a personal spirit being, Almighty God, who has always existed in eternity past, before space and time. As the creator of all that exists, he is above all that he has created. Humanity has been made in his image and likeness. In fact, all of his creation reflects his attributes. This is the one true triune God, who has chosen to reveal himself through his creation, through scriptures which he himself has inspired men to write, and ultimately through his own incarnation, Jesus Christ. Accordingly, we have the Creator God, the origin and the source of all life, or ultimate reality, and then we have the creation, comprised of all the material things in nature, including human beings, as well as that human beings recreate, including their works of art. Now I'd like to talk about focus, artistic focus, and source of inspiration of the artist. I believe there is a foundational issue to be addressed by dealing with some pivotal questions regarding the artist's focus and source of inspiration. Now, in the material creation, we could ask this question: is the artist's focus and source of inspiration the material creation? Is the work of art the artist's expression of something perceived within the realm of the material creation? In other words, is art a reflection of the material creation? If so, then how does the artist perceive that material creation? As I mentioned in the preface, much has been written about how throughout history Western culture's perception of reality has drifted away from objectivity, order, and form toward subjectivity, disorder, and fragmentation. This is the result of abandoning a biblical worldview. In a materialistic worldview, the only available option is to appeal to some authority other than the perceptions of artists, namely science, to tell us if the material creation operates according to the order of intelligent design or the disorder of chaos. The perceptions of science have changed in sync with changes in worldviews. Throughout most of human history, the discoveries of science revealed order in the material creation. It wasn't until less than 200 years ago that speculative science started to question that intrinsic order. And now, with more recent discoveries, many scientists are once again perceiving a pervasive order throughout the material creation. Of course, since pure science is based on physical observation, it cannot inform us about anything that existed before space and time or anything existing outside of the material creation. As the perceptions of artists change in sync with changes in worldviews, the focus of artists also change. Generally speaking, it has been quite some time since the beauty of nature has been the focus of artists and their source of inspiration. Notwithstanding various revivals of neoclassicism, objectivity, order, and form no longer represent the general artistic milieu of our modern and postmodern age. And then a word about our humanity. I think it accurate to say that today the vast majority of works of art are not focused on things in nature, but rather, almost without exception, focused on the individual self, or the collective human society and culture. This being the case, we must ask again, how does the artist perceive humanity? And such a self-centered and man-centered predisposition begs this question: has art been reduced to being only a reflection of our humanity? Whether it is the expressions of the emotions and imaginations of the individual artists, or reflections mirroring the human condition, or attention-getting statements of cultural commentary, will the focus of artists continue to be limited to increasingly bizarre expressions of what they perceive within the realm of our humanity? If so, then however unique and novel an artistic expression may be, its source of inspiration is solely human. It is merely subjective perception, and essentially humanity reflecting itself. Regrettably, with the vast majority of today's artists operating within a worldview of naturalism, this is commonly accepted to be the nature and the purpose of art. But again, this essay is a call to something beyond that. Beyond that, to the attributes of God. As I stated in the preface, this essay is a call to God-centered art. This is an appeal for artists who hold a biblical worldview and are inclined to find their source of inspiration in nature and in humanity, to focus on the attributes of the Creator in His creation. And perceiving that reality from a biblical worldview, to unapologetically endeavor to communicate, express, reflect the attributes of God in their works of art. To define the attributes of God would be like trying to define God Himself, for His attributes speak of His essence, nature, and character. Indeed, since God Himself is infinite, we may find a list of His attributes to also be infinite. And while it's not within the scope of this essay to attempt to list, define, and classify the attributes of God, I would strongly encourage artists to dedicate themselves to a lifelong study of God and His attributes. There are many good books on the names and attributes of God. The scripture narratives which bring forth the various names attributed to God are like miniature portraits of His essence, His nature, His character, and therefore His attributes. Again, in an age in which the vast majority of artists are inspired to express themselves and are focused on making politicized cultural critiques of the human condition, this essay is a call to God-centered art which communicates, expresses, and reflects His attributes as the reality which the artist perceives in nature and humanity. So we've talked about the material creation, we've talked about humanity, and we've talked about the attributes of God as they are reflected in the material creation and in the man being created in the image of God. But what about God Himself? The attributes of God we may perceive in nature and humanity are commonly referred to as His communicable attributes, which can therefore be communicated through works of art. Attributes of God which belong to Himself alone are referred to as His incommunicable attributes, not to be found in nature or humanity. There are attributes of God that are not found in nature or humanity. But cannot these incommunicable attributes of God also be communicated through works of art? Cannot a work of art be the artist's expression of something perceived outside the realm of the material creation? In other words, cannot art be a reflection of the spiritual realm? If so, its source of inspiration would be something outside of both nature and humanity. It would be an artist's attempt at an objective perception reflecting God himself, in contrast to the artist's subjective perception of the spiritual realm. And for those having a supernatural worldview, this is what they would consider to be the nature and purpose of art. I think it very important to make some clear distinctions at this point. It is possible to have a supernatural worldview without having a biblical worldview. A biblical worldview is specifically based on that which is found in the Old and the New Testament scriptures of the Bible, whereas Eastern worldviews may be based on a variety of Eastern scriptures. In the Eastern worldviews, humans have eternally existed as spirit and are divine. But in the biblical worldview, humans receive spirit when God, namely the God who has revealed himself in the biblical scriptures, breathes his life-giving spirit into them as created beings, and through faith and regeneration they receive the divine nature and the life of the Eternal One. In the biblical worldview, humans are not divine. In the Eastern worldviews, humans are divine. In the biblical worldview, humans reflect God. Therefore, through their works of art, Christian artists may seek to express something objective, something outside of themselves, and something outside the whole created realm, something of God himself. I'm going to close with what I've entitled a foundation for a biblical aesthetic, and essentially it's a summary. I offer the following summary as a foundation for a biblical aesthetic. In the biblical worldview, God is ultimate reality. For the Christian artist, art is the communication or expression or reflection of one's perception of that reality, who is God. And since God has chosen to reveal himself through his creation, through the scriptures which he inspired, and through his incarnation, Jesus Christ, the Christian artist's perception of God and his creation is shaped by a vital relationship with the person of God through the agency of his Spirit and in the context of his written word. The attributes of God revealed in his creation, in his written word, and in his living word, Jesus Christ, those attributes of God are the conceptual forms by which we perceive and communicate our expressions and reflections of God. Therefore, the purpose of the Christian artist is to communicate through works of art his perceptions of God and his attributes.